Alright YouTubers, this is a disposal list and this will be my 9th beginner's guide for Battlefield 1. In this video I am going to talk about tanks. So I'm not going to go into as much detail as I have done in my previous videos about class primary weapons. I'm not going to be discussing the underlying synthic data or the mechanics of the weapons themselves. I'm just going to describe the functionality of each vehicle and each variant and maybe suggest one or two things you might not have seen otherwise. So you probably noticed that these vehicles get snapped up real quick in game, and a lot of players I know don't even realise there is a customized screen where you can look at the different tank and plane variants and pick and choose which one you might like to play. So I'm going to go through each one and just note the differences between them, try and make some observations and help you out with your choice when it comes to spawning in game. I'm not really a tank or plane pro, but I've got to rank 50 in each. I've used them a fair amount in game, and hopefully I'll make some observations and let you know some details that you didn't know already. I'm also going to very briefly cover cavalry and maybe even talk about transport vehicles that are available in game. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking about tanks. You can see here there is a shortcut menu available, just like there is for the infantry classes. That's probably as much as most people get to see, but I'm going to use the customized menu, which, just as with the infantry classes, gives you a bit more detail over here so you can help make your variant choice. So we have 5 models of tank, and first up we're looking at the Landship here. If you're familiar with any World War I tank, this is probably it's pretty iconic. The large tracks and the side guns do obviously have an in-game function, much as they were designed for in real life. Those great big tracks are useful for crossing over trenches. I think most of the other tanks, if you tried to actually drive across a trench, you'll have difficulty. With these tanks, you can go across trenches without any problem. All sorts of terrain will be accessible at some speed or other. This tank will make it across. Those side firing guns were intentionally designed like that so that when crossing trenches you could fire left and right into them. But the other bonus of the double gunning, one on each side, is of course that if you have your friends with you, then you've got double the firepower of most tanks, and you really can take out enemy tanks quite quickly with 2 buddies in the tank with you on those big guns. So first of all, the Mortar variant of the Landship. You can see in this corner here it's flicking backwards and forwards between the 2 variants of its weapons. Your primary front-facing weapon is a light machine gun, and your secondary is the high explosive mortar that's rear mounted on this tank. And in action that can go up to 200 meters, so it says it's effective against both infantry and vehicles at longer ranges. High explosives mortar is not so effective against infantry, although I think this one has a higher yield than, say, the support guy's high explosive mortar. The high explosive mortar is much more for taking out enemy vehicles. And long range, would you call 200 meters long range? I guess it is, but I'll tell you why I don't think the Mortar Landship is the real long range Landship when we get on to the next one. So your passengers there, as I say, have the 2 57mm high explosive cannons, your standard tank shells there, and as secondary fire they have case cannons, which are the tank equivalent of a shotgun for infantry, really, anti-infantry action. And your passengers there in position 4 and 5 have got light machine guns to help out. You've got a smoke screen which you can fire to hide yourself when you're repairing, for example, and you've got an instant track repair. That doesn't repair any damage, just damage to your tracks. If you're immobilized, you can get moving again more quickly. So next up is the Tank Hunter Landship, and this is the Landship I would say is the long range version. That tank Gewehr, that Tank Hunter rifle in the front of the tank there is an extreme range weapon for taking out enemy vehicles. It's the same tank Gewehr rifle that is used by the elite class that you can pick up in map, and it can fire the length of the map and still be pretty easy to hit enemy vehicles, and often you'll find those vehicles just don't know where that's coming from until it's too late. So you've also got the 2 standard anti-tank guns on the side. and they have a secondary fire of that case cannon, that tank version of a shotgun. It also very usefully has an emergency repair, not just the tracks. This can repair, I think it's 10 or so damage immediately, so when you're out of action, when you're stuck, you hit that emergency repair and you can move to cover. The gas emitter is also pretty useful if someone does get close up to you, infantry gets close to you when you're concentrating on something at long range. So the last Landship is the squad support Landship, and immediately you can see it's got this new frame on top compared to the others, and I believe your squad members are intended to ride along on that, although I don't think I've ever seen it used that way. You certainly could. The front firing main weapon is an HE autocannon, it's called, and the reason it has the auto there is that it does actually fire like a machine gun, but it is high explosive rounds that will do damage to vehicles, albeit not as much as a main tank shell would. Maybe if you got them all on target, you'd be talking equivalent damage. It has a rear firing light machine gun. The secondary for the tanker helps keep the infantry off if they're crowding you, but you've got plenty of buddies hopefully too to do that. You've got the standard 57mm high explosive cannons on the sides with the secondary of that case cannon shotgun equivalent for tanks, and 4 and 5 have light machine guns. So you can do a tank repair, a track repair, sorry, not a full tank repair, just the track if that's damaged to keep you mobile. And its secondary function is to drop supplies. Again, that's dropping medical and ammo crates, much like those class supply and medic classes would. So next up I'm going to talk about heavy tanks, and you can see in the description here it's nicknamed the Moving Fortress, and that is what it is. It has extremely good armour all around. You can barely see the tracks to target them, though they can be damaged independently. But the main difference is going to be the weaponry and what you have in the assault version. This is what they call the medium range version of this tank. In the assault version you have those standard tank variant guns. You've got the 57mm high explosive cannon, that is your main anti-tank shell, and you've got the alternative of the case cannon, that tank equivalent of the shotgun. At the rear, these are not the alternate weapon for the driver. At the rear you have passenger used twin heavy machine guns, so that's a lot of firepower pointing backwards, anti-infantry firepower at least, and I think small vehicles, heavy machine guns can damage, and you've got heavy machine guns all over this thing. When you've got this tank fully loaded, there's a lot of damage output it can do. And it's got the emergency repair, that's repairing any damage done to the tank, and it has a smoke screen. If you're taking extreme damage and want to get away, you can pile on that smoke screen and then perhaps move and repair yourself. So next up we have the heavy breakthrough tank, and this is the one that is being described as a long range version, and that is true because what it has as its main weapon is a 57mm AT cannon, and that is much like the normal high explosive rounds damage wise, but I think it's a higher velocity. It goes further, has less bullet drop over its firing over distance, and so it's easier to hit things at longer range. Not as good as the tank Ver on the Landship, but still a good long range version of a main tank gun, and it has that secondary case cannon, the tank equivalent of a shotgun. On the back there your passenger has twin heavy machine guns, so again a lot of damage going out the back there for infantry and light vehicles, and on the sides we have HE autocannons like that was on the front of that squad support Landship. So the HE autocannon is like a rapid fire machine gun, but that's firing high explosive rounds that can damage any vehicle. So if you want to go anti-tank, best to go diagonally on so that you can employ the main gun and one of your passengers can employ the HE, the high explosive autocannon. It's got emergency repairs, as I said earlier, that can repair a small amount of anything to keep you moving, and it can drop supplies. So it's also a squad support in that it can drop medical and ammunition supplies. And the last heavy tank is the heavy flamethrower tank. This is the one that it described as close combat, close range tank. And its main weapon is the standard 57mm high explosive cannon. I don't know whether it's me or I'm imagining this, but it seems that that has a shorter range, maybe a lower velocity on that round, a bit more of an arc if you try and make it to a longer range, but I think it also has greater splash damage. I could be imagining that, but perhaps it's been tweaked to suit it to be a close range anti-infantry as much as anti-tank round. And the alternative in the recent patch, this was changed, the secondary fire, it now uses a flamethrower. I've noticed that is really quite short range, but perhaps the ones on the side are just as short range. So you've got a flamethrower that can take several infantry guys out, but they really do have to be close up. And your passengers 2 and 3 have heavy machine guns. Passengers 4 and 5 have further flamethrowers. So this is the tank that you want when you are driving up into, you know, heavy infantry in, say, a close quarters town environment. You've got the emergency repair to get you out of immediate danger. That'll repair anything, not just the tracks. And a gas emitter, again, further enhancing its close quarters capability. You can keep those infantry back while you burn them. So next we'll talk about the light tanks, and it says in the description here that they are more nimble but have less armour, and this is true. But nimble can be a bit misleading. They're not actually faster than the heavy tanks. I believe in their original incarnation back in beta and back in the first release they were fastest, but it was deemed that in combination with their smaller size and the fact they can turn better, having a higher speed really made them way too good. So they've actually had a bit of a speed reduction from their first incarnation, but they still are smaller, so they can get down smaller alleyways, they can get through archways, they can even get into the ballroom in the Ballroom Blitz map if you really want to. They can get where the other tanks can't, and they can hide behind other things, obviously, that the other tanks can't, so that could make up for their armour being somewhat reduced. They also, 2 of the variants at least, can fully rotate their turret, and this is a big advantage. If you're in third person with a fully rotatable turret, then infantry have a real hard time sneaking up on you. So first of all, the light close support tank. This has a high explosives. It's on the wrong description there, it does that. This has got a high explosive 37mm cannon, so that is reduced from the 57mm standard tank shell that we saw in the other tanks so far, and it's got a light machine gun as a secondary fire. There's only one person, just the driver, in these tanks. It can repair its own tracks to keep mobile, and it can drop supplies for your group. That's medical and ammunition supplies in crates. So the next light tank variant is the light flanker tank. This is described as being the close range combat tank, and that is certainly true. It has an HE autocannon, as we've seen on other tank variants. That's kind of like a machine gun, but it fires high explosive rounds that will do damage to all vehicles. There's quite a bullet drop, quite an arc in the fire of that autocannon, which means it is rather difficult to aim at longer ranges. It's probably due to it being a low velocity round. Secondary fire, there is the case autocannon, so that's the tank equivalent of a shotgun, but an auto version, so that fires multiple shotgun shells in succession, then has a brief pause while it thinks about things, and then will fire another 15, I think. And you can actually swap backwards and forwards between those 2 fire modes in the middle of the 15 round volley, but it just takes a few seconds after that 15 round volley to reload. So you can see it has track repair to keep it mobile, and its secondary function there is the anti-tank mine. So you have to be careful with that. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. If you go dropping anti-tank mines and someone then puts a round near you, it might well destroy you with your own mines, but it's also very useful to have encourage a larger tank to chase after you, and they wouldn't realise necessarily that you've dropped mines in your wake. And the last light tank to talk about is the long-range version, the light Howitzer. This has the Howitzer 75mm high explosive cannon on the front, so that does a nice amount of damage and has good long-range capability, and it's got a heavy machine gun as its secondary fire. to take out infantry and light vehicles, I believe, with those heavy machine gun rounds. It's got a full emergency repair, so it's a small amount, but it'll repair any type of damage and get you mobile. And it has a smoke screen as that secondary function to further get you out of trouble. You can see the turret slightly different on this howitzer, and it is indeed quite restricted on its point of view. You have to turn the whole tank to shoot behind you. That turret only actually rotates about 90 degrees. So the next type of tank to talk about are the armoured trucks, and they are what they sound like. They're not strictly tanks. They're a little bit more manoeuvrable in that they drive like a truck. They go pretty fast. You wouldn't want to try and drive one over a trench though. They steer faster though, effectively. So they're single driver vehicles. The primary weapon, I think, that comes up as default is the machine gun. This has a light machine gun as a primary weapon. The secondary weapon, the large one, is the anti-tank cannon, this weapon on top of the truck. And when you change to that, you are put into a first-person view, which has a large mechanical sight, and you can actually then zoom in and it gives you a scoped view, and I believe it zooms into what looks like at least 2 times zoom. And the aim for this anti-tank cannon is that you do long-range artillery-like attacks. You can see it's also got an emergency repair function. That's a small amount of damage repaired. And it has anti-tank mines, again, like the light tank that has the same. You've got to be careful not to drop them and then sit around next to them, but they're very handy if you are being chased by another vehicle. You can drop those and hopefully they won't even notice. So the next variant is the armoured anti-aircraft truck, and it is very similar, except on top, instead of that anti-tank cannon, it has an anti-aircraft gun. Now that anti-aircraft gun is very similar in characteristics to the stationary anti-aircraft guns you'll find on the maps in-game. It has a reduced number of rounds before it overheats. You can see it also has full emergency repair, much like the other artillery truck, but it has a smoke screen as its secondary function. I guess that would help you nicely avoid being dive bombed by the aeroplanes you're trying to destroy. And the last armoured truck variant is the armoured mortar truck, and as you can well imagine, the secondary fire from this is a mortar. The front default fire there is a heavy machine gun, so there's also a slight difference, gives you a bit of anti-light vehicle capability, but the mortar there is more for dealing with infantry from range, because it's an airburst mortar, not a high explosive mortar, so that is anti-infantry. It will do very little damage to vehicles, and it has smoke variants for delivering cover for your attacks, and gas variants for gassing the enemy. And our last type of tank is the assault tank. This is the Saint-Chamond tank that came with the They Shall Not Pass downloadable content. The main difference for this tank from the others is the sloping front end. Its profile is the main difference. A sloping front end, when you hit it in the front, you are quite likely to get a slide-off shell, a glancing shot, a ricochet that does little damage. Also, it having a very flat top means if you hit that top, it will tend to slide off and just do minimal ricochet damage. You're really better off aiming for the big flat sides or the back or the front, but from very much front on. Any angles and shots will slide off quite easily. It can be a bit tricky driving. I think it's fair to say it's faster than some of the other tanks, but these tracks do slide around a little. It's not great for getting across tricky terrain. So the variants of the assault tank. First of all, we have the field assault, and on the front we have a 75mm shell, so that does a good amount of damage, but as you can see it specifies here it is low velocity, so it really has quite an arc when you fire it. It's a little difficult to fire that to long range. This is what I call the short range variant of this tank. Its secondary fire is still 75mm, so still a good amount of damage. It's the case cannon, the equivalent, so it's got a big old tank shotgun as its secondary fire. And in all the passenger positions we are seeing heavy machine guns, so they can deliver a good amount of fire to small light vehicles and infantry. It's got a very interesting secondary function where other tanks would have smoke or gas or whatever. This has a pigeon carrier. and artillery is the important word there. And in game what this does is it throws a pigeon out of a little side door, releases it into the air, and then within a few seconds you will get an artillery strike on your position. This actually does a small amount of damage to your tank itself, but does a massive amount of damage to anyone that's in close proximity. So driving that into a town and letting your pigeon go can clear all the surrounding buildings of infantry that might otherwise harm you. And it also has an emergency repair function. So the next variant to talk about is the gas assault tank. This is a bit of an odd bird. You can see it's got the 75mm main gun, but what that's firing is as a main fire is an air burst cannon, and as it says here, it's a unique delayed fuse high explosive shell. And when you fire that, if you fire it low down, it will actually bounce until its fuse tells it to go off at a certain time from being fired. If you fire it a long way, that fuse might mean it goes off in mid-air. I imagine that's how it's designed, since it's called the air burst. So you've got to be quite careful with the timing if you want to try and take out multiple infantry or damage a vehicle. You need to make sure that that shell is over the top of them when that fuse runs out. The secondary fire there is a 75mm gas cannon. Now that fires a shell that explodes as a gas grenade at its destination. And we have the standard 2, 3, 4, 5 positions for passengers, having heavy machine guns, which gives a nice amount of damage to light vehicles and infantry. It's got a gas emitter from close range. It really is a full-on gas assault tank, and it's got that emergency repair function. And the last variant of the assault tanks is the standoff tank, and this is a little odd too. You can see it says it's the long range version of this tank because it has a high velocity 75mm gun, which does fire very nicely. There's little bullet drop, which makes it easier to aim at long range targets. And it has this spotting searchlight. When you fire that off, a spotlight comes out of this node on top of the tank, and a blinding light is shone in front of you, which you can control, and anything that it falls under it is spotted as if you'd used the spotting function in-game, 3D spotting function. So it's very handy to spot your targets and then take them out with that high velocity round. But as it says in the description, this is somewhat at the cost of survivability. It is an enormous beacon that says, "Hello, I'm here." Now, whilst that spot gun is up, you can't actually be targeted too well. I mean, they can shoot straight at the spotlight, but they can't see the details of your tank very well because it's quite blinding. But obviously, it just draws attention to your position for everybody that's in an arc in front of it. It has a secondary of heavy machine gun, and it has 3 passengers with heavy machine guns, not the 5 that the other variants have, and it can throw a smoke screen up, which is probably quite handy after you've just made yourself obvious to everyone on the battlefield. The final thing to say about these assault tanks is they're a bit unique to the other tanks. If I just flick through them, you can see that the profile of them actually changes. That's another reason I think they say the survivability of the standoff is somewhat reduced, because it has a larger front profile and it doesn't have any protection on the tracks. The gas assault one there has the low profile and protection on the tracks, so it's possibly the best protected, followed by the field assault tank there. So that is tanks, YouTubers. Thanks very much for watching. If you like the video, please leave a thumbs up. If you must, leave a thumbs down. Please leave comments if you have anything to say, any ideas for other videos, or any critique of this one. Thanks a lot for watching. See you next time.